Everyone, good morning. We're about to start, so please, if you're ready with your cameras, let me also welcome you to the UN Day press conference. As you've read, I'm sure we have with us here the SRSG and head of UNSOS, Catriona Laing. We have to her right, Anita Kiki Gbeho, who is one of the deputy SRSGs here in Somalia. And we have to her left, George Conway, who is also deputy SRSG and the UN resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator. And last but not least, we have to my left here, we have Aisa, forgive my pronunciation, Kacyira, yes, who is the ASG and head of UNSOS, the UN Support Office for Somalia. Once again, we have 1 hour opening remarks followed by your Q&A. So without any further ado, over to the SRSG.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be joined by you this morning on the day after UN Day. And you've had introductions from my colleagues from the top team here in Somalia. It's a great pleasure that we're actually all here together, because this is not it's not always that easy to get everyone in the same place. So it's great to be with my colleagues today. So just to set the scene, so yesterday was United Nations Day, and it was the 78th anniversary of the day in 1945 when the UN Charter entered into force. And it's an important anniversary, and it's an occasion to recommit with hope and determination to build a better world for all of our aspirations. And as you'll all be aware, there are many, many challenges in the world at the moment. Live horrible conflicts in Ukraine. We've obviously had the recent horrible situation in Israel and Palestine. Numerous challenges on the continent here of Africa, and some of the challenges we face in Somalia. But the United Nations stands there ready to support on all these challenges. We've been here in Somalia pre-independence. We've been here through some of the very tough times that Somalia has faced. And most recently, the mission that I head, the UN political mission, was established here in 2013. Just to explain the setup here, we have 3 missions. We have my mission, the political mission. My deputy is Kiki. You'll hear from Aisa shortly about the UN Support Office for Somalia, which provides a lot of the logistic support both to ATMIS and the UN, as well as the government of Somalia. And George here heads the UN country team. So it's between the 4 of us, that the 3,000 people who are here for the UN in Somalia do their work to support the people of Somalia and, of course, the government. And one interesting thing to note is that this UN colour you see behind you in blue, my nails as well, is also the colour of your UN flag. And that is not by coincidence. We are told that one of the reasons that the Somali flag chose that UN colour is in recognition of the blue from the UN. So the Somali flag and the UN flag share that colour. And I think that is a signal, a very strong signal of the strong collaboration between the United Nations and Somalia. So having set the scene a little bit, let me just say a few words on some of the issues that are top of our minds at the moment, but you'll hear more from my 3 colleagues here. So firstly, and I've just come from New York actually, where I gave my second update to the United Nations Security Council, is obviously the politics in Somalia, which you'll all be tracking very, very closely. And there's been some progresses, but frankly, there are some challenges. And with the National Consultative Council specific proposals that were put out in May for a future electoral system in Somalia, these continue to dominate the political debate. And we're at quite a crucial moment where we need to agree collectively under the leadership of the government is the way forward on elections, the kind of model that Somalia will pursue, the timeline, the sequencing of elections, and of course, very importantly, to try and bring Puntland back into this process, because it will be very hard to complete, well, not just elections, but the whole legislative frameworks and the process around developing a constitution for Somalia. And without a constitution, a country will find it very hard to move forward. The constitution are essentially the rules of the game, which govern how a country is legislated, is governed. And Somalia really needs that constitution to be nailed down. As you know, we're working still to a draft constitution. So some challenges on the politics, but there has been some progress. Secondly is the situation in Lasanud, which remains difficult and quite tense. At the moment on the ground, the situation is relatively calm and people are starting to return home. But obviously the underlying drivers of this conflict, which resulted in a number of people killed, a number of prisoners taken, need still to be resolved. And the United Nations has 3 messages, and we engage with all key parties, President Denny, President Bihi, the recently established SSC administration, the elders, the Dubahalante clans, everybody, and of course the government. The 3 messages are: number 1, please make progress on the detainee exchange as a confidence building measure. Secondly, important for everyone to commit to no more violence. And thirdly, of course, to find a peaceful solution to the disputed territory, which also means tackling some of the underlying drivers of the conflict. So that's on Lasanud. On the security front, thirdly, as people will be aware, there was a recent request for a pause in the drawdown of ATMIS troops, and Aisa will say a little bit more about this. This is in recognition that the government was facing challenges conducting the counteroffensive whilst also generating enough troops to take over the forward operating bases that are held by ATMIS. This time is being used wisely to do some reconfiguration, some resetting, and to replan the military strategy. So I think that was welcomed and has been endorsed by the African Union Peace and Security Council, as well as in New York. Looking ahead, the government is in intensive preparations for a conference in December in New York, which will be looking at the, the post-2024 security architecture. What kind of support will continue to be needed from the various international partners, including the United Nations, looking ahead to a world where ATMIS troops will have departed. So there's intensive work going on to prepare for that conference. Also on security, it's important to note that reclaiming an area from al-Shabaab is, of course, only step 1, although a very important step. Those areas need to be stabilized, and people need to see the benefit of the government returning to provide services for the people, to enable their livelihoods to progress, to ensure justice is delivered. And that work is called stabilization, and the United Nations is providing the coordinating forum around stabilization. So very important to consolidate those security gains. So that covers political and security issues. I wanted to touch briefly on the set of issues around women, peace and security. And this is a really important area for the UN and for me personally, as the first female SRSG in Somalia, but luckily supported by 2 very, very able female colleagues. So this, for the 3 of us, and of course for George, is a really important area. And the UN works here through a program which is a joint program with the government on women, peace and protection. And this is essentially around empowering women in their roles as peacemakers. We all know that women play a very important role in security, and there's no lasting peace on the ground unless women come in to support and help deal with those underlying tensions and drivers. Secondly, on women, and I've heard directly myself from many of the female leaders here in Somalia, brave women who stand up for women's rights, who are doing pioneering work, and they urge me strongly and my team to continue to advocate with the government, with Parliament and so on the importance of women having their rightful place at all the top tables, including, crucially, in politics. Because women need to see other women in strong political leadership roles. And I'm afraid this is an area which is always difficult in many countries I've worked in. The proposal here for a 30% quota for women is very, very important to break this cycle, to get enough women at the table, for women to represent the views and rights of other women. So let's all commit to work together to continue on ensuring that women have their rightful seat at the table. And then just 2 final points. I wanted to mention human rights. And there are some encouraging bits of progress here, particularly on the legislative side. And I want to commend the federal government for approving recently the Disability Rights Bill and the Child's Rights Bill and the Juvenile Justice Bill. It's a very important issue in Somalia is the age of a child. We now have for the first time an age verification policy, which is the first formal procedure for age assessment in the country to confirm that a child is actually under 18. The UN has provided technical support to all these bills. It's a good example of the kind of work that we do here in the UN, but there's more to be done. So on the age of a child, for example, the next step is to harmonise all the legislation and policy around embedding formally that a child is under 18, and that affects things like child marriage, it affects the age that a child can legitimately join the military and so on. So that's a really important next step. And the second area where we're really focusing is around legislation to address sexual violence crimes. Somalia has signed up to many of the international human rights obligations here, but it needs to enshrine this in law. It's a really important part of protection for women. And I know for all of you as journalists, the media bill around protecting freedom of expression is hugely important. And this is an area we keep a very close watch on. We've done 3 reports on ensuring that that the government adheres to its obligations to ensure that all of you as journalists can do your jobs freely and report so that people understand what is going on and without any intimidation. So rest assured, this is very much top of our agenda on human rights. And then finally, just another positive note, though, for me to end on, is Somalia's work towards preparing for completion of the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. This is to enable Somalia to write off most of its debt. It's a very important milestone for Somalia. I'm pleased to say that the final piece of the jigsaw was met recently, and Somalia should be moving to completion point in December. This will enable Somalia to access much larger soft loans and grants, and that will be important for Somalia's economic development. So investment, for example, in your coastline, your very important coastline, which will enable you to drive forward from an economic perspective. So lots more to say, but I'm not going to cover it all. I want my colleagues also to come in there. So I think it's over to you, Kiki, next.
Thank you very much, SRSG. And as the SRSG mentioned, my name is Kiki Gbeho, and I am her deputy on political affairs. So when it comes to supporting the government with its peace building and state building agenda, we work as a mission in 4 key areas: inclusive politics, rule of law, human rights, and security. The government has elaborated very clear priorities moving forward, and these priorities include the constitutional review process, finalizing the national security architecture, completing the judicial model, and resolving disputes. And all these areas are directly related to the support work that we undertake as a mission. Whether it's through the good offices work of the SRSG, our convening role, advocacy, capacity building, training, we support the implementation of the goals and priorities of Somalia. Concrete and visible support, you've heard the SRSG talk about some of our areas of work, but just to elaborate a little bit more, for example, when it comes to the judicial model, we supported the government to convene and hold discussions around what a final judicial model would look like under the constitution review process. We also have been supporting the strengthening of police and community policing throughout Somalia. The SRSG talked about the joint program on women, peace, and protection, something that is dear to us as leadership here in Somalia, particularly attaining the 30% quota. We also have worked very closely with government, with civil society, with our sister UN agencies on the Joint Justice and Corrections program. This has supported so far the provision of legal services to close to 18,000 beneficiaries in Somalia. The majority of these beneficiaries have been women. We have also supported the establishment of 16 alternative dispute resolution centers throughout this country, and 13,000 cases have been resolved as a result. We also have the joint program on human rights, We're in the second phase of that program right now, and it's supporting Somalis to advance human rights through dialogue and capacity building. The SRSG has talked about some of the bills that we have supported government to put in place, including the Child Rights Bill and the Disability Rights Bill. When it comes to inclusion, one of my personal favorites, and I'm not supposed to have a favorite, but it is one, is the work that we have been undertaking recently with the National Disabilities Agency. Over the last 2 years, we've supported them to undertake a survey, a perception survey, so they can understand the issues that face people with disabilities in Somalia. When I was in school, I had a professor, and he used to tell us, if you can't measure it, you cannot manage it. If we do not understand the challenges that people with disabilities face, there will be no way we can support the government to resolve these issues. And maybe last but not least, in conclusion and picking up from where the SRSG left off, I can think of no better time than the 78th birthday of the United Nations, an organization which was founded to build peace, to recommit to Somalia's goals, that is to agree a federated state of Somalia and to enshrine it, as you said, SRSG, in the Constitution. Agreeing this Constitution, the SRSG called it the rule book, will help Somalia reach its vision, a Somalia that is at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. I thank you, and I think now I hand over to George.
Thank you very much, SRSG, Deputy SRSG, Head of UNSOS, colleagues, appreciating the opportunity to discuss with you today and to brief on the work of the UN country team in support of the overall UN mandates for Somalia that do cross humanitarian, development, human rights, peace, and political mandates. The UN country team in Somalia is comprised of, in addition to the mission structures, of at least 20 agency funds and programs. These include some of the big agencies like the World Food Program, UNICEF, UNDP, as well as a number of smaller technical agencies like UNIDO, ILO, and others. I don't want to list them all, but they're familiar names to you, many of them. And they come together in the form of the UN country team to align against priorities agreed with the government of Somalia to address key development challenges facing the country. The country team does include both development and humanitarian partners, and many of the UN agencies are so-called double-hatted, doing both humanitarian and development work. And frankly, in the past couple of years, we've tilted to a quite robust humanitarian response because of the needs of the country. Last year and at the beginning of this year, with the significant severe risk of a famine as a result of a drought, that was the worst in 40 years. We scaled up our support to authorities at the national, state, and local levels to prevent the drought from sliding into a famine. At the height of the response, more than 6.3 million Somalis were receiving some form of assistance from the UN, whether it was food assistance or cash or support for nutrition and hygiene and water and sanitation or other services. It was an important part of preventing the country from falling over the brink from a protracted drought into famine conditions. Now, the GU rains, when they came, ameliorated the situation, and food insecurity across the country has improved, but it's still significant and still a serious challenge. We estimate right now about 4 million Somalis are living in different levels of food security crisis. And that's a lot. That's a very high number. And 3.8 million Somalis are internally displaced across the country. That number itself increased by 1 million people over the course of the protracted drought. So right now, today, in addition to the baseline of humanitarian need in the country, we're very concerned about the impact of El Nino on the dear rainy season. We've already in the past 2 weeks seen flash flooding happening in a number of cities throughout the country. We have seen river levels rising. We have been working for the past months with the government at federal level, with SODMA, the Somalia Disaster Management Agency, but as well as with the humanitarian affairs ministries at state level on preparedness measures and to try to reduce the impact as best we collectively can on the population. The estimates that we have right now are that the rains are likely to be the worst that we've seen in at least 20 years, with the most recent worst rains in 1997. And again, the estimates indicate that perhaps 1.2 million Somalis could be impacted by flooding over the course of the next 3 months, and 1.6 million hectares of land inundated as a result. These are forecasts, but they're based on science. And we've already seen the impacts on cities and towns across the country start to materialize in practice, and impacting disproportionately on already displaced communities, on IDP camps and host communities that were displaced as a result of previous crises in the country. So we are working, like I said, with the government at different levels on preparedness. We've done a lot of work to help government, local governments and state governments identify evacuation areas in high ground areas, provided maps, and provided data. We are doing monitoring of river levels in support of the government in order to give early warning notice to communities so that they can be informed if they have to move. And we're providing packages of early response support to those communities that are directly impacted with support in the areas of food or cash or hygiene or water or sanitation or the other areas that we're focused on. It's important to note that we have allocated significant resources to this response right now. We have $15 million allocated immediately towards the rapid response. However, our humanitarian response plan for this year is underfunded. It sits at about 39% funded as of today. And that is compromising our ability to scale up the response as much as we would have preferred. And we are appealing to donors to come in with their generous support to enable us to ensure that we're responding to the needs as they're likely to manifest over the course of the next months. In addition to the humanitarian, these types of crises that I've spoken to, whether it's drought or the floods, these are recurrent. These are cyclical in Somalia. And the cycles are getting shorter and shorter, and the impact is getting higher and higher. And what that necessitates from the Somali authorities, supported by the international community, including the United Nations, is to invest in solutions to reduce the risks for the future, to reduce humanitarian needs for the future, through targeting the types of development deficits that have been a structural challenge for the country over recent decades. There's been far more money spent on humanitarian response than an investment in development in the past 2 decades. We have an opportunity now. The SRSG mentioned the HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries process, which will be completed at the end of this year and will enable an expansion of a development agenda. And that development agenda needs to focus on addressing the underlying drivers of these types of cyclical crises and risks and threats for the future, and build greater resilience of Somali citizens and Somali institutional structures to be able to manage these types of crises more sustainably into the future. So we are seeking to rebalance our engagements from principally humanitarian to much more developmental engagements to reduce, again, risk for the future. We do have a development cooperation framework that we're supporting the government across multiple areas. Much of the work that we do is directly joint with the mission structures in support of the state building agenda, justice, the rule of law, and others. But we're making increased investments into climate adaptation, into environmental management, into certainly the stabilization agenda, and expanding basic service delivery systems into newly accessible areas where people haven't had access to recurrent service delivery, some for a very long time, over a decade. And we have opened a new funding window called the Somalia Joint Fund, which has now become operational, and we have a pipeline of next generation of development engagements coming online. So we hope that this is a good opportunity to pivot our engagement towards a focus on solutions and reducing risk for the future to help the Somalis achieve their vision, your vision of sustainable development, peace, and prosperity and progress towards the globally agreed Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda by 2030. It's going to be a tough next couple of months, most certainly with the anticipated floods, but it also is a massive opportunity coming up over the next couple of years to really accelerate Somalia's progress towards the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, DSRSG Conway, folks. And now we have ASG Kacyira.
Thank you. Dear SRSG, colleagues, Deputy SRSGs, colleagues here present, distinguished members of the press, good morning to you all. It's been a great honor and pleasure for me to lead the UN Support Office in Somalia since my appointment by the Secretary General and arrival in Somalia in April of this year. For those of you who may not know, UNSOS is the quieter member of the UN family. You may not always see us up close, but we are there, busy working in the background, providing the much needed logistical support to various clients and ensuring that operations can run in an effective, efficient, and agile manner. Our work is possible thanks to the guidance and support of our strategic headquarters in New York, the strong partnership that we have with the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, the troop and police contributing countries, and most importantly, the government of Somalia, and of course, our UN family. So we're here in support of the vision of the government and people of Somalia towards peace, stability, and prosperity. And my colleagues have really very well elaborated that. The clients we serve to this extent are the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, called ACMIS, the Somali Security Forces, UNSOM, and the other parts of the UN family in Somalia and the broader international community. For ACMIS and SSF mainly, we provide non-lethal logistical support as they fight against Al-Shabaab to ensure the security and protection of the population and the ability of us as the international community in supporting them, as has been very well articulated. This is a daily and complex effort. And just to situate it into what SRSG mentioned, we are right now under the process of transition. And I want to say that when it started in June, everything went well, as you may, I'm sure you did see. But because of the ongoing offensive and at the same time the transition, the government requested that there be a pause. So as had been planned in September, it didn't take place, but it's hoped that it will take place in December. As of now, we continue to work very closely together. And I want to say that we have great teamwork and collaboration amongst all the partners. Just to also elaborate what this means in terms of what we do, because it requires a lot of movement of personnel, as you can imagine, material, supplies around the country, by air, by land, and sea. We provide food, water, and fuel. We run helicopters, we've got vehicle fleets. We provide radio, phones, and connectivity for communication during these military operations. You also provide medical services and medical evacuation by air for ACMIS and SSF troops. We know and honor the sacrifices these forces have made and continue to do so in fighting for peaceful Somalia. Apart from the security side of things, UNSOS has also stepped up in providing support in other areas, especially in the aspect of logistics. For instance, while we don't have a development mandate, when called upon and when it's critical, we, for example, maintained and resurfaced airstrips around the country, notably in Baidoa, Johar, Dusamareb, and Beledweyne. We've built firefighting capacity at airstrips. In Mogadishu in particular, our firefighting training and equipment supports access to also by commercial airlines. And once in a while, we also called upon government to support. I think the recent one was where we were requested to support government to transport examination materials to hard-to-reach areas. This is just a brief snapshot of the support that UNSOS provides to its partners. Looking ahead, we expect that this support will continue and enable a smooth and sustainable changing security landscape, as reflected in the Somali transition plan, which will see the Somali security forces assume full security responsibility from ATMIS at the end of next year. As SSF takes up more and more security responsibilities, it's of key importance that they are trained and equipped accordingly. Through the UNSOS administered trust fund in support of SSF, we do our very best in implementing priorities set by the Somali government in this regard. We are, for example, training Somali security forces in the spheres of aviation operations, aviation security, and medical evacuations, and management of other logistics-related fields. In the context of this transition, UNSOS supports the logistics around also the handover of forward operating bases from ATMIS to the Somali security forces. And this includes gifting of some of the facilities, the utilities, the UN generators, water treatment plants, establishing some more long-lasting water points, and handing all this over with associated relevant training to Somali security forces to ensure that it's all well managed and goes and is sustainable. All this is done in the spirit of building capacity and sustaining operations and supporting security. As we go through this transition, I would like to take this opportunity to say that UNSOS remains committed to carrying out its role as a strategic enabler for its clients for the ultimate benefit of Somalia. And I want to commend the great collaboration and support we continue to get from the government of Somalia and its people, and also from our other partners. And we do trust that the success of our mission in Somalia will really be defined by how the Somali security forces fully take up their responsibility, and Somalia can take charge of its own security and development. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, ASG. Thank you, DSRSGs, and thank you, SRSG, media colleagues. We now have the Q&A. Our first question goes to Mohammed Kahir from China's CGTN. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity to say happy birthday to the United Nations. I think in the last 75 years of its existence, the world has been so peaceful, I think. So I have three questions for each of the officials here. Question number one to the humanitarian sector. You mentioned about the funding gap, and how is that impacting your operations on the ground currently on the impact of ongoing El Nino? You mentioned some statistics about the farmland impacted, and also the number of people expected to be impacted in this. I wanted that. On the political sector, as you know, the federal government of Somalia has recently organized the SSC Khartoum administration. What is your position on that? And are your organization, the UN organizations, on the ground, or will be deployed on the ground, or providing support, something like that? And that question goes to UNSOS. I've seen a report that you've provided 3 helicopters to the Burundian forces to support the ongoing operations on Shabab. Somalia currently is facing, sanctions. Are you extending that in the future to Somalia's armed forces? Thank you. I have those 3 questions.
Folks, we may need to move the microphone around too, so please be patient.
Very good, and thank you. An important question. As the situation stands right now today, we have initial resources in hand, flexible funding that we are using to respond to needs as they arise and to support the initial preparedness and pre-positioning of some supplies to support communities that we know will be likely impacted by floods. However, if the scale of the flooding manifests over the next 2 to 3 months at the levels that the science indicates it likely will, we will be very hard pressed to respond at the scale necessary. And we are appealing to donors, and we're undertaking, for where there's already been flooding and flash floods, we've undertaken assessments to see what the scale of need is. At this stage right now, we're able to engage. If it does flood to the extent, as I mentioned, it'll be very, very difficult to get supplies in place to support with shelter, with access to fresh water, with appropriate support to health and prevention of disease, especially cholera, sanitation. That is a concern to us. So we continue to engage very actively with our donor community to ensure that we can go to scale if and when necessary. Thank you.
Second question.
Thank you. Yes, the question on the SSK and the recognition. I think my understanding is the government has not recognised this area as a federal member state, but has recognised them as an administration, and therefore a body they will engage with. The UN obviously doesn't recognise bodies, but we note this administration and are also engaging with them in order to be able to deliver, as you mentioned, the humanitarian response that is sorely needed. I mean, George can add if I get anything wrong, but my understanding that there are about 200,000 people displaced following the fighting. So it has been a huge priority for us to get in there. OCHA, which is the humanitarian part of the UN, has provided $2 million, focusing on health, wash and nutrition. So those are people in Lasanud. There are obviously many people who've been displaced. So we're also providing support to those who have been displaced, and even as far as Ethiopia, where some people have moved to. The priority, obviously, going forward is to move beyond the emergency response to try and support rehabilitation and reconstruction and so on. But we'll need to be assured that there is sufficient security to enable that. The final thing to say on this is that there's a lot of unexploded ordnance in this area. So our team from the UN Mine Action Service has been on the ground to identify where that ordnance is and to train people to be able to dismantle it safely. So the situation at the moment is relatively calm. As I mentioned, people are returning home, but obviously long-term development is going to require security and underlying grievances being tackled. Thank you.
The third question was for Aisa Kirabo.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your understandable question. I just want to highlight two things, that the reason why the Security Council actually did increase the number of aircraft in this season was to enable the transition amidst an active threat of Al-Shabaab, so that the troops, the ATMIS troops working in coordination and jointly with SSF, could be able to confront the offensive and at the same time reduce the number of troops, because that is what it was planned for. And that is enabled by the funding of assessed contributions. Now, when it comes to support to SSF, while the numbers have been increased, we don't yet have access to assessed contributions. It has to come from that trust fund. And so in that regard, on the list of the identified areas of support, the aircraft is not there. And even that which is there, which is really very basic, we're not able to fully meet it. I want to take this opportunity to really thank our donors, and especially the UK, the US, and others coming for their support. But the context is that, and even though they are Burundian run, but really they're supporting security in Somalia, and that is why they're able at least to address the offensive, but continue to reduce the numbers. That is the purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Our next question goes to Amina Hassan from Gobjog News. Amina?
maadaama ADMIS ay Soomaaliya ay ka baxayso shaqada UN-ka iyo ADMIS-na ay isku xiran tahay macquul ma tahay in ay baxaan UNSOS?
Since ADMIS is leaving, on the work of UN and the ADMIS seems connected. So is that possible that UNSOS also leave after ADMIS?
Is that to me? Yes.
Yeah.
To ASG amongst-
That's it, yeah.
To me. So thank you very much. It might be worth asking Aisa to also comment, because as I think it is quite a complex architecture that we have here. So just to explain again, so UNSOM is a political mission, and it has its own mandate, which is actually about to go through the Security Council resolution to be, we hope, extended for another year. The ATMIS then is a separate mission again, the AU troops. Then we have the UNSOS mission, and the UN support mission in Somalia provides support both to ATMIS and also to UNSOM. So we are distinct missions, but obviously we work very closely together. I mean, there are links. So the ATMIS troops provide very important security for all of us on the ground. You know, it is ATMIS troops who protect the AAIA, for example. So we are dependent on each other in that sense. But each mission is distinct and different, and the Security Council determines the missions independently, but obviously taking account of how the different missions work together. Aisa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I didn't get the question very well. If you can repeat.
I think the question was whether UNSOM would leave when ATMIS would leave.
Oh,
So
whether
I think-
ANSOM would leave.
So when ATMIS leaves, but I think your mission is probably more closely linked to ATMIS. So the two leave together, I think, is the question.
Okay, all right, yes.
Oh, this is a bit awkward, isn't it? We need a better system.
Yes, sorry. No, thank you very much. What I can compliment is that UNSOS is here to support ATMIS and SSF, as I mentioned, in availing logistical support for them to be able to deliver on providing security. And so, and as the UN, we would only be here as long as there is a national or multilateral organ that we do support in that regard. That's what I can say for now. But the whole process of discussing that and defining and deciding on what will happen, I think is on course. And as we go, it will be defined. So thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. We also have a question from the Spanish news agency EFE from Nairobi. Pablo, over to you. Can you hear us okay? Pablo? Pablo, if you can hear us, we'll come back to you. I think you're on mute. And in the meantime, we'll go over to, from Arladi News, Abdirahman Jalani.
Thank you very much. I have two questions on media, on press freedom and security issues. First question is, Somali media are under fire or under attack. Your contribution is in rebellion in this country, and it is armed. We're using intimidate, persecute, and target by the government or government authorities. So, what is your intentions to defend Somali press freedom? That is the first question. And, second question is, in your latest address at UN Security Council, you discussed about some political tensions in Jubaland and southwest in Somalia that caused by illegal term extension. The tension is still there, and there's no progress so far. Are you willing to interfere the situation if it turned into a violence?
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask my deputy Kiki to take the second question. On the first question about media freedom, which is a very important one, and I did mention it in my opening remarks. So as you know, we're all guided by, obviously, by the law. The Provisional Constitution, Article 18, does in theory guarantee the right to freedom of expression. And there's a media law which also enables freedom of expression in line with the Constitution. So the legal parameters are there. The key, of course, as in many areas in Somalia, is implementation. And we as the UN, our job is really to do two things, or three things. One, it is to monitor the situation and to report violations. And we do that through various reports. We're required as the UN to do periodic reports. And in fact, we're about to publish one shortly on freedom of expression, which documents really, really carefully the progress and the challenges that are there. And that document is one we will therefore use to do the second thing, which is advocacy. So we monitor and then we use the data we gather to advocate with the government on the importance of implementing their own constitution and their own laws on this. And then thirdly, we do quite a lot of capacity building, some of which is done, I think, Ari, through your shop, isn't it, through capacity building with journalists, so that you are not only become better journalists, but also are equipped to hold your government to account in relation to your own freedom of expression. The final thing I would say on this is it links to Somalia's aspiration, which is a good aspiration, to become increasingly a responsible member of the international community. And to do that, and to not just be a subject to discussion at the UN, to be part of the UN shaping the international architecture, the more progress Somalia can show that it's made on these basic freedoms, including freedom of expression and human rights more generally, the more Somalia will be a respected member of the international community. So we also use that to advocate as to why it matters. The world is watching Somalia, and as you progress on your journey to state building, freedom of expression is one really, really important pillar. Let me turn to Kiki for the second question.
Yes, on term extension, I think the SRSG was clear that the constitutional review process is critical because that sets out the rule book. And once that is done, there will be clarity on what Somalis decide. This is not something that can be decided by external actors. It needs to be decided by Somalis. I think you've all seen the UN in the past use our good officers role where they are difficult issues, where they are at times intractable. You will see the UN play a role trying to understand what the different sides of the issue are and then support the different actors, the stakeholders to find a solution moving forward. So in sum, I would say this is a decision for the Somali people. It underscores the importance of the constitutional review process. The NCC has put a model on the table, and we will continue to support this process. I mentioned in my remarks that we will support the constitutional review process, hoping that that will provide the rule book in terms of the way forward when it comes to terms and other serious issues for Somalia.
Colleagues, we have time for about roughly 3 more questions, so please, if you can keep your questions nice and compact. From our colleague in Nairobi, the Spanish agency EFE, the question is, his microphone isn't working, his question is the withdrawal of ATMIS by the end of next year viable, in your opinion, given what has happened in recent months? From the Spanish news agency EFE.
Thank you very much. So as you'll be aware, under the ATMIS mandate, which is endorsed by the AU Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council, ATMIS is due to exit by the end of December. It is important, of course, that the capability is there and the capacity is there to take on the roles that ATMIS performs. And I think in recognition of, as Head of UNSOS said, the challenge of fighting the campaign at the same time as generating enough forces to take over the forward operating basis, there has been a request for a technical pause to enable a bit more time for the second phase of this drawdown from September to December. The second thing I think to say is that the government is gearing up now with support from partners, including the UN and the AU, for a big conference in New York in December, which is going to look at the post-December 2024 security architecture. So recognizing that there is going to be ongoing need for support from partners in probably maybe slightly different configurations going forward. But they will lead by setting out their vision for what they think the gaps are and how those are best filled. There will be an open and frank discussion, and any proposals that emerge from that will then, of course, go back to the AU Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council. So I think that's the situation we're in. So we'll be taking stock in December and taking the work forward after that. Thank you.
Next question goes to Horn Cable, Mohammed Ibrahim.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. I'm mistaken. Thanks to everyone. Okay. Thanks to everyone here. My question goes to the UN representative in Humanitarian Coordinator, Conway. Thank you so much. I'm Somali. Cable TV. I have said my name is Conway. I also been in these hands of UN for almost 11 years. I'm former refugee. Before this talk. As you have said, 4 million people in Somalia need for humanitarian aid, 3.5 million displaced people who need help. And you have said 1.6 hectares of Somalia will be dedicated for this El Nino. Light. We all know you are, and you have also said UN have money agencies that is going to do the mission of this agency and to help the Somali. You all know you have also, you have said that to promote and facilitate the mission of the United Nations in Somalia. What are the agencies working for when displaced people in Mogadishu pay water? They pay water, and many UN agencies working for these people. When many people or many displaced people in Mogadishu have no shelter, they live just houses that made for clothes and small stickers that cannot even small wind. And you are talking about El Nino. In last 2 weeks, I have been preparing a report, and just I have released in cable. You can just go and just see that report. I interviewed and went to prepare a report, 800 displaced people who live outside of Mogadishu. At the day I was reporting, I have witnessed an old mom died for hunger. And that's the place that I have seen them paying the water. 3 gallons, 20 liter, they pay $0.1. What is your support? Where's your humanitarian aid? Where are the agencies? What obstacles that agencies have to build concrete houses to protect these people, to hide from El Nino? Will we be witnessing when these 800 people go to the flood when El Nino happens? What's your support? Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very important question. And again, it is currently right now a very complicated situation, and I fear it only gets worse in the next few months as the El Nino impact kicks in. You know, a lot of our support to IDPs, IDP families and communities has come through different types of assistance, including through cash transfers, so that people have cash in pocket to be able to buy basic necessities. As I mentioned, we scaled up our assistance to prevent the famine from happening. And at the maximum, we were doing cash transfers to over 4 million people. The number of people that were able, given our financial constraints right now today, the number of people, well, at least by August, was about 1.8 million people. So our support directly to displaced communities has gone down quite substantively because of the funding challenges. Now, we are trying to mobilize more money in order to bring that back up. A lot of the money that we received this year early on was committed and spent in support of Somali citizens across the country, in almost all areas of the country, to prevent the famine that was then ameliorated by the GU rains. Since the GU rains, our funding has gone down, and that means the coverage of our humanitarian response has likewise gone down and is not sufficient at this stage. And this is the advocacy that we're doing with broad partners in the international community, especially as we go into this El Nino season, and we know there will be significant additional displacement. We're already seeing it start to happen from flash flooding. That said, a lot of the, just on internal displacement per se, and on IDP communities, a lot of these communities have been dependent, they've been displaced many years ago, some of them, and remain in very vulnerable situations. So what we're trying also to work with government is on shifting from humanitarian-based assistance to more empowering development assistance to either integrate people into local communities, to support them if they so desire to go back to their areas of origin, and to find what we call durable solutions for this displacement. Because we can't have such a high level of people across the country chronically dependent on humanitarian assistance. We have to empower people to find permanent shelters, to be able to access gainful employment, to be able to access the services they need for their families, whether it's health, education, or water, and it needs different types of assistance than what has been provided largely thus far by the humanitarians. And it is something that the government is very keen to, again, pivot the way that we do business and that we support these communities directly. But it's a complicated situation, in particular, as we look forward to the potential impacts of El Nino, and I am genuinely concerned.
Folks, we have time for one more question. This is from Abdullah Mumin, who is a journalist and also one of the senior officials of the Somali Journalist Syndicate. Abdullah, can you hear us okay over there?
I can hear you, Ari. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. You can hear me well?
Yes, we're tight for time. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. SRSG Catriona, thanks for this opportunity to speak directly to Somalis. This was an opportunity that many of your colleagues have missed so long. So congratulations for that. My name is Abdullah Mumin. I'm a journalist, and I'm the Secretary General of the Somali Journalist Syndicate. I'm posing, I think, 3 or 4 quick questions. One about the mandate of UNSOM, and one will be referring to the dispute resolution mechanism. Another one will be Las Anot, and finally one about the journalists. And I hope this will be enough. UNSOM is mandated by the Security Council to provide strategic and policy advice on various aspects, including peace building and state building. This also includes monitoring human rights and health coordination in the efforts of the international community. Sadly, the UN mission has long been described as a branch of the corrupt clan-based government in Mogadishu. Instead of conducting its work independently, and knowing the fact that UNSOM has stopped publishing its human rights reports, the UN mission now looks like to have become a subject to this corrupt and abusive regime in Mogadishu. My question here to Ambassador Catriona is, after all these years, after all this funding, do you foresee any meaningful contribution by your office, UNSOM, to the Somalis in terms of improving the rights, women and girls and children, vulnerable communities, promoting accountability and justice? Question number 2, referring to something Ambassador Kiki has said, the alternative dispute resolution centers. Can you mention just one case that has been resolved? Just one case. On question Las Anot, back to Ambassador Catriona, you have mentioned 3 main issues, if I recall well, on your statement of Las Anot. And this includes detainees to be released, ensuring calm and escalation. But surprisingly, you haven't mentioned anything about accountability. can you speak about a bit about accountability, holding accountability for the killing and shelling of civilians in Las Anod? Finally, in your opening remarks, and I've listened also to your recent statement to the UN Security Council on October 23. Despite your statement seems to be saying something about human rights, you haven't described anything related to the major attacks against journalists. Just last week, we lost one colleague called Abdifatah Maalim Noor Qais of the Somali cable television who was killed in Mogadishu. You haven't condemned this in your statement and in your opening remarks this morning. I'm surprised by that. Was this intentional? And will you condemn all the attacks against journalists, including those conducted by the SSF that you are supporting? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. Excuse me. You've directed two at me, 1 and 3, and then I'll pass 2 on to Kiki. So I think on your point about our mandate, our core mandate, and what are we actually achieving, I think is your key kind of question. So I think on the mandate is very broad and gives us good officers' role in resolving various disputes, and there are many around Somalia at the moment. One very live one you've mentioned is Las Anod, and I'll come on to that. But there are tensions. There are tensions around term extensions. There are tensions, frankly, because of even agreeing the process by which there should be agreement around the constitution. So this is not easy. This country is on a complex journey of state building. There are numerous layers to this, the foundation of which is, frankly, rule of law, which my deputy has mentioned, and that includes justice, it includes accountability, and all of this has to be in place. It's not perfect, but I think we have got examples where we, the UN, have made a concrete difference. And I mentioned some of those which are in the human rights domain, where I think both Kiki and I are pleased with the progress around the Disability Rights Bill, for example, the Child's Rights Bill, the Juvenile Justice Bill. And all of these bills need to be linked to Somalia's international obligations. And then, of course, ultimately, a law is only there and useful if it's implemented. So we're not there yet, but I think in terms of making progress, I think we have got examples where we've done this. You've specifically talked about the area of human rights for journalists. And one of the reasons I didn't cover this in detail in my statement is that we're about to put out a report on exactly this topic. It's incredibly detailed. I've gone through it in a lot of detail myself because every word counts, the way we craft things, the way we word things, our recommendations. It does recognize some progress, but frankly, it does recognize also that there is quite a long way to go on freedom of expression for journalists. And we do speak out. We speak out sometimes privately because it's more effective. There's some things that we do very publicly. But rest assured, this is very high on our agenda. Finally, on going back to Las Anod and on accountability, you're right, I didn't mention that in my opening remarks, but that's not because it's not important. And I agree with, I think, is the sort of underlying sort of tenor of your question, which is when there has been conflict, when atrocities have been committed on both sides, one hugely important part of moving forward and dealing with the underlying drivers of any conflict is that people feel there is accountability for injustice. And that is something that is very firmly on our agenda to all of the different interlocutors who have a part to play in bringing a long-term peaceful resolution to Las Anod. The reason I mentioned the detainee exchange is because in many, many conflicts, that is often step one in building confidence and therefore creating a foundation on which there can be accountability. So there is some sequencing to this, but accountability, you're absolutely right, is crucial. Let me turn over to Kiki for the second question.
Yes. Thank you. We can provide a more comprehensive list of some of the disputes that have been resolved. But for example, land disputes where people have been asked to leave their land and have gone to the ADR for some kind of solution. Also personal disputes What comes to mind immediately was a case between a woman and her husband. ADR helped to resolve it, but we can definitely find more examples of what these cases were and precisely where the ADR has supported. So that can be provided. And maybe in terms of reports, we do issue public reports even right now, SRSG. I think on your desk you have recently cleared a draft that is with government. We always circulate the draft so that they're reviewed, and if there are any comments, we take those comments on board and we publish them. Can we do more? Of course, we always can, but I do think that in terms of monitoring and speaking out when the opportunities arise, we try to take them, and we'd be happy to engage further on how we can strengthen our support and our advocacy moving forward. Thank you.
Folks, we have one last request for a question from Ali from Arladi. Please, very quick and very tight. We're on a tight schedule, so much appreciated. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Al-Shujaa from Aladi Media. My question is, if Southwest State and Jubaland exceeded their time without agreed timeline, what will be your action, Mrs. Evoni?
I think on these time extensions, I think Kiki replied to an earlier question on this. I think at the end of the day, it is hard to get full consensus and agreement, because every time a change is made, there are winners and there are losers. But the key for us is to facilitate inclusive dialogue, comprehensive dialogue, and for the people of Somalia to agree with their government what the process is going forward, and for us to come behind that to enable the elections, when they do happen, to be fully representative of the people. So it isn't for the UN to decide this, but to recognise when there are tensions and disputes, and then use our good officers' role to try and find a way through this in a way that at least there's broad agreement, even if not everyone is going to be fully happy, because people will never be fully happy when there's a change. As I say, there are some people who benefit from that and some people who lose out. Is there anything you want to add, Kiki, to
No,
that?
I think you've done well, SRSG.
Okay,
In that
thank
case, senior officials, media colleagues, thank you for your time today. We'll have photos, transcript, and video very shortly as well. We hope this was useful for you. Thank you very much, senior leadership.
And thank you, journalist colleagues. Great
Thank you very
to
much.
see you
Thank you.
this morning.